Let's knit some full fisherman's rib. We're working on a double knitting board, otherwise known as a double rake. It is not terribly important whether these pegs are exactly opposite one another or maybe a little bit skewed. You can make the wrap work in either case. Starting at the left, this is a pretty common wrap. I'm going to skip the peg on the very left back and wrap across, then forward, across, and forward. So the second wrap of each pair is directly across, or the nearest peg to directly across if yours are skewed from the loom. But as I wrap, you may notice something. On this front board, there are in fact already 2 wraps, and shortly you will see how it happened and why it matters. Now I'm going to knit the 2 over the top one that we just wrapped. But on the other board, I'm not going to knit anything over. Let me flip it so you can see it. It now has 2. My light is not getting right in there, so there you go. See, 2 wraps per. And every time we end up with 3 on a peg, we're going to knit 2 of them, the bottom 2, over the top one. And because we only knit over one side every trip across with the yarn, this tends to go quite fast. And the wrap on the way back goes the same way, but of course in reverse. Behave yourself, loop. And you can see the loops like to just sort of sit there. So when I get across, I'm going to give the fabric a downward tug. That'll settle everything down, and it'll behave better from here on out. In this case, let me get this so you can see. We'll wrap, 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 all the way across. So every left to right row goes the way that I showed you on the first pass, and every right to left row goes this way. I've got a tangle in my yarn. Excuse me just a minute. Okay, tangle taken care of. I'm back. Now, even though we're not going to wrap the front, we did wrap, we are not going to knit over the front board this time. I will knit over the end stitch, just to anchor matters. And now we'll knit over the back board. This very end stitch may only have 1 wrap on it. The way I wrap, it does, and that's okay, don't worry about it. The others are all 2. Oh, well, they're all 3, and we knit 2 over the third one on the top. This time, knitting off the backboard. You can turn your work if you want to, if you prefer to have the pegs towards you when you knit over. I don't mind knitting them off the back like this, so this is how I tend to do it, but it makes no difference to the outcome. And just as before, when I'm done, I'm going to give the the already knitted work, a tug downward. And we're ready to go again. And here is why my end one is likely to end up with only 1 wrap on it. because I'm going to skip it to begin the row to get this sort of cross hatching that the yarn does. But remember, the first one I wrap does lean to the right, but the second one is directly or close to directly across from the first one. Leaning to the right, directly across. Leaning to the right, directly across. That's what I'm trying to describe for you. Now, because this is a left to right row, and we just knitted over the back on the last row, I picked up my pen to use as a loom tool. Doesn't work. But because we already did the back row last time, this time we do the front row. If you want to pull down before you get very far, as I just did, that's fine. In some cases, it can really help. So we just keep going like that for as long as we want to. Next, I want to show you what happens when we get this off the loom, because that's the exciting part. I'll finish hooking over here. Back in a minute with this off of the loom. Okay, here's what was below the full fisherman's rib. This is a version of double-sided stockinette. It is double-sided stockinette, but I was working some Wanderlust cables on it. And I left it on the loom so you could observe the difference when we changed to full fisherman's rib. Here is what it was like while on the loom. But it's on one strand of yarn now. When it relaxes, look what it's going to do. It's ribbing all right. It's ribbing on both sides that looks the same. And it expands in width about to twice the original width. It depends, of course, exactly on the yarn. It does not tend to pull in the way that regular knit one, purl one ribbing on a single board does. But it looks just the same, and it is ribbing because we alternated from front board to back board, so it truly is. It does not roll at all, but the main thing that makes this so cool is that it gets so wide and it's so non-rolling that it's a perfect stitch for shawls and blankets. I think you can see, let me give you some perspective. Yes, my sample is actually more than twice the width of the same yarn in double board stockinette. Now let's cast on a little bit of it so you get the feel of that. This time I'm using a Kiss loom, which does not have its pin boards attached. If you have a Kiss, you'll know what I mean. This is just the peg boards, and they are spaced at the ends with a series of washers. I have not specially spaced it to match this yarn. I'm just casting on. I'm not really going to knit a piece. But I wanted to show you the easy way to do it. Kisses work just as well as any other double board. So we'll start as usual with a loop on a peg and do the same wrap we did left to right. Advance a little bit to the right, come forward to the peg just across for however many we want, stitches that is, remembering that our work will get wider. At this end, there are actually some options about exactly what we wrap and when to get going back the other direction. But what I just did is, I think, my favorite. Let me do it again. I wrapped to the front of the front peg. Now I'm going to go across and put a second wrap on the back peg. Front peg again. one way or the other, you may end up with either an extra wrap or minus a wrap on one end, as we were looking at while we knitted. But that's okay. Now, in order to keep all this stuff behaving itself and from jumping off, we hang what's called an anchor cord. This is any piece of sturdy yarn in a contrasting color. And the contrast is just because it's so much easier for you to spot. Drop it over the knitting and down between the pegs. You can see this side better. Rotate the loom enough that you can get a hold of this and knot it together sturdily at the bottom. This is not part of the project. It'll be tossed out. So looks is not the issue, sturdiness is. Now we can use it to pull down. This is actually used in quite a few double board stitches, or it can be. But this will allow us to get our work started without all that floating and misbehavior of stitches. And for the cast on, I do knit both boards over. You don't have to, and you don't actually have to use this cast on. The good thing about it is that this one will be closed and won't ravel and will allow the fabric to stretch enough. If you were to use one of the cast-ons that's usually neat and tidy, it would pull in the end of the work. And while there might be reasons to do that at some point, usually we want this work to expand to the width that it can. Pull down. And even so, it doesn't necessarily make our first row perfectly neat. I'm going to push the loops down and pull with my anchor cord again. And now let's start wrapping this one. Skipping my first one on the left to start the diagonal pattern. And from here on, it's just like all the others. This first row, since I did knit over every stitch on each board, there will only be one loop to knit over. Next row will be the backboard's turn, and it will have 2 loops, and from then on the project will be just as it has been. And off we go. I'm knitting this one just to hold the yarn. This one only has a single, but here we are back to the normal pattern over here. So that's it, full fisherman's rib for any double knitting board. One more thing before I leave you to do it yourself. Do you see how already this is pulling down? And eventually, if you want to, you can drop out that piece of waste yarn because you'll be able to tug on the fabric itself, as I was doing with the pink sample. But see what a help this is early on. Up to now, I've actually been showing you one method of turning at the left end and a different method of turning at the right end. But if you need both sides of the fabric to match, it doesn't make a ton of difference, but they will look slightly different if you do what I've been doing. We knitted off this one already, so we would start not going around this one first, but around this one to replicate what I've been doing on the other end. So in this case, I will only have one loop to knit over when we get back to this end. The rest of the wrap goes the normal way. And as usual, I'm going to anchor this stitch even though it's not this board's turn. Knit these over. Now up to now, my left end, I've been skipping the leftmost back peg when I went to begin the wrap, but I could include it and do what I did on the other end. I'm going to look at that again. Across, forward, and now slant to the right. This method, and the one that I've been showing most of the time in this video on the right, creates just a little bit more robust of an edge. The skipping method of the first peg, whichever end it is, creates a little bit more delicate of an edge. So you may want to think about what exactly it is you're working on. You might make a different choice for a blanket that's going to go on the sofa than you would for a baby garment. And here comes our work down through. This particular sample would be very loose and open. I'm spreading it out so you get a look at it. And you might want that for some things. I would not recommend it for a baby blanket, though I would for an adult summer shawl maybe. The thing that causes this is a relatively thin yarn, probably a number 3. I've got this loom on a setting that would easily do a number 4 or possibly even a number 5 yarn if I wanted a denser fabric. Therefore, it will be somewhat lacy without doing any transfers. This is fine for an adult, but baby fingers, if my tool will go through there, so will a baby finger. And they tell us that the babies can get caught and hurt themselves like that. So I wouldn't use that for pets, and I wouldn't use it for infants. But as far as adult summer wear goes, it could be delightful. Here are the edges of our first sample, and they were done differently. The one that I'm holding now and showing to you is the one where I skipped the first stitch on the left side of the back. This was the right side. Where I didn't skip, I actually doubled one of the stitches so as to get the direction changed and the same slant going without skipping a stitch. They are a little bit thinner to the eye, not a ton. They definitely feel thinner to my fingertips. But the difference, as you see, is not enormous, so I wouldn't get all stressed out over this decision. But if you care very much, you will want to match the edges.